orders controlling the movement of all vessels in United States navigable waters. The Federal Emergency Management Agency has activated 8 urban search and rescue task forces in New York, and 4 of these highly trained teams are at work here in Washington at the Pentagon. Every federal agency has implemented continuity of operations plans to make sure the government continues to function effectively. While the markets closed today because of the situation in Manhattan, the United States financial system has continued to operate. Banks have been open all day. The Federal Reserve has operated regularly and continuously. The Department of Health and Human Services has mobilized medical personnel and supplies to provide help to local authorities who are working so diligently to respond and try to help the victims of these terrible attacks. President Bush has committed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to identify and bring to swift justice those responsible for these despicable attacks. The Department of Justice is setting up a hotline for families who fear that their relatives may have been victims of one of these attacks, and we will be announcing that telephone number shortly. Our fellow citizens and our freedom came under attack today, and no one should doubt America's resolve. President Bush and all our country's leaders thank the many Americans who are helping with rescue and relief efforts. We ask our fellow Americans for your prayers for the victims, for their families, for the rescue workers, and for our country. Thank you all very much, and we will continue to update you as information is available and confirmed.
When will the president return to the White House? Will he go back to Washington?
One of his most trusted aides, and she's speaking on his behalf, giving us an overview of what the situation is today. He's talking about how the president ordered assistance, federal assistance for the local communities that were involved, including New York City, of course, and she said no one should doubt our national resolve in finding these people and punishing them who harmed American citizens on this day. There were a couple of additional pieces of information. Even vessels that are on navigable waters are now being controlled by the U.S. Department of Transportation. All flights will be grounded until noon tomorrow. We had already heard that. Banks did remain open, so financial services were going on today, and every federal agency had a contingency of operation plan that has been put into effect. We still have on the phone now for us one of the senior advisors in several administrations, former Secretary of State and former Secretary of the Treasury, James Baker. Mr. Baker, there's not a lot more that can be done at this hour, is there?
No, I don't think there's a lot more that can be done. I think the administration is doing what they can do and what they should do. And there's not really a lot more that can be done at this very moment, Tom.
At some point in the next 24 to 48 hours, though, the president is going to have to address the nation. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, I think so. I don't doubt for 1 minute, but that he will. Now, he's already made 2 statements, I think, since these events occurred, and I rather suspect that when we get to an appropriate distance from the happening of the events, he will probably choose to address the nation.
Well, we're all most concerned right now, obviously, about those people who have been severely injured, those people who have been killed, those people who are still missing, and I want to emphasize that as our primary concern. But just looking ahead a little bit, there are going to be also economic consequences for this country just at a time when this economy is in a troubled state.
I'm not... if you're asking me that, Tom, I'm not too worried about that, frankly. I think, we have a lot of systems in place that we have never had in place before as our economy weakens. Yes, we're in a weakening period here for the economy, and yes, events like this cannot be good for that. But I really am not too concerned about that. I think that you may see some negative consequences initially, but over the long haul, I think things are going to be fine.
Mr. Baker, we appreciate it very much, and we'll just ask you if we can once again to presume on our long-standing professional relationship and kind of keep you on call throughout the day, because this is going to be a long day indeed.
Well, I enjoyed talking to you, Tom, but I'm going to have to, at some point, I'm going to have to find a place to sleep tonight since I can't get back to Texas.
Well, we'll make sure that it's not too late, but we intend to be on the air here for a long time. But at any rate, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. James Baker, former Secretary of the Treasury, former Secretary of State. He was, of course, President Bush the 41st, as we called him, his point man in the Persian Gulf War, tried to head off that war by meeting in Geneva with Tariq Aziz. That was unsuccessful. The war did go forward. He's a man who spends a good deal of his professional time now worrying and working on these matters that brought us to this sad state of affair that we find ourselves in America today. So we're coming up on 4 o'clock in the afternoon Eastern Time, one of the longest days in America, at 8:45 on a sparkling September morning here in New York City and in the nation's capital. There were 2 wholly unexpected and devastating attacks on the Pentagon and on the Twin Trade Towers. And then another plane went down outside of Pennsylvania, and we are still dealing not only with the physical effect of those attacks, all the injuries, the deaths, and the damage that has been done, but we're just beginning to have a full appreciation as well of the political and the psychological damage that may have been done to this country. Ron Insana, James Baker, as I was not surprised, said, I think we'll be okay, but there's been so much talk in the American economy about the confidence of the American consumer and how we need to kickstart the confidence of the American consumer. That is going to be a concern.
Absolutely, Tom. And the one thing that the Federal Reserve, in its effort to manage this rather noticeable slowdown in the U.S. economy, the one thing the Federal Reserve was counting on was maintaining consumer and investor confidence. It was apparently easier to maintain consumer confidence with lower interest rates than investor confidence, but the consumer has been relatively strong despite the weakness we've seen in the economy. Housing sales had been near record levels, auto sales near record levels, and so by lowering interest rates, the Fed was keeping those things affordable and keeping the economy afloat. I had occasion to talk to someone who asked to remain unnamed, but who is familiar with how the government works during periods of crisis when it comes to economic matters, and obviously says that the New York Federal Reserve needs to, and some of this is rather technical, check how all the financial parties who have obligations to one another in Lower Manhattan are doing right now. It's a so-called settlement process. Who can make good on what trade or investment to whom? The New York Federal Reserve, as we stated earlier, has promised to provide enough money to keep the economy afloat through this difficult period, given that the center of the financial world has been attacked today. There is a process that will go forward. What is impaired physically in terms of trading systems, exchanges that are housed in the World Trade Center? What isn't? How are the books in shape? These are the issues that economic policymakers, Tom, have to deal with in the next 24 hours. There has been a great deal of speculation that the New York Stock Exchange will not open for business tomorrow. We don't know that to be true. Some worry that you don't disrupt financial markets regardless of what's going on in the world, because the disruption, even if for another day, can have a bigger psychological effect on the markets than if the market were to open and absorb the reaction to this calamity today, Tom.
All right, thank you very much. CNBC's Ron Insana, who was on a different kind of an assignment today when he was caught when that first building went down there, and we're grateful, obviously, that he was able to get out of there after a pretty terrifying time for him and for so many other people as well. We're now in that difficult period of trying to determine just how many people still are trapped in the World Trade Center area, people who were outside the building as well as within those towers when they came down. The rescue efforts have been proceeding cautiously because so many buildings down there are unstable. There was a lot of collateral damage when the buildings came down by the force of the winds and the force of the shock of the explosion of the buildings coming down. Just take a look at this, if you will. That's 110 stories of steel, concrete, glass, and electrical circuits collapsing to the ground in what amounted to be a heartbeat. And then all of that smoke and all of that dust and all of that debris began to explode out from the base of the building through the canyons of Lower Manhattan. And no one expected it would happen as swiftly as it did, obviously. And that's what they're trying to deal with down there, and there still is an enormous amount of debris in the air and certainly on the ground. The financial institutions that are located there have established 1-800 numbers, and they're calling their workers. This is the plane, the second plane that went in. Still is hard to imagine, isn't it? And obviously there was somebody at the controls who knew exactly what he wanted to do in this case, which was to drive that plane into the second of the twin trade towers. We were all still dealing with the...
This is a KARE11 News special report.
Good afternoon, I'm Paul Majors. We want to bring you up to date on what's happening locally in response to today's terrorist attacks. On the bottom of your screen, you will see a list of the companies, businesses, and schools that are closing early. Reaction from today's terrorist attacks is pouring in from all over the world. A short time ago, former Vice President and Minnesota native Walter Mondale talked about the tragedy. He told reporters he never thought this would happen on American soil. And despite the devastation and overwhelming devastation, Mondale urged Americans to stay calm.
We will not eliminate our own freedom in response to them, because if we did, then they would surely win. We've got to find an American answer to these monsters. And we'll only do it if we stay calm and resolved.
Mondale says the first thing we have to do is find out who is responsible, but he says he considers this an act of war. Well, in spite of today's attacks, the wheels of democracy keep turning. The polls are open for primary elections being held today, most notably mayoral primaries in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Again, the polls remain open until 8 o'clock tonight. That's it for now. We will have more news updates roughly on the hour or as the situation warrants. Right now, though, we will return you to network programming.
This has been a KARE11 News special report. Stay tuned for further details.
I was on foot this morning heading down to the World Trade Center area to meet a crew to cover this story when it first broke. On foot because all transportation shut down, police barricades, no way to get in by car. And as I walked down toward that area, thousands of people were streaming toward me, going away from that area, trying to escape the devastation and the potential danger. As I walked toward it, we all heard a rumble. There had been one tower still standing at that point, and we turned and gasped in just a horrific sight, as you've seen many times throughout the day. You've been watching that tower just cascading down. People watching from about 20 blocks north in relative safety saying, oh my God, tears, screaming. Unbelievable that there would be people in that building and near the building whose fate it was almost inevitable that they were going to be severely injured or killed. As far as the casualties, the numbers are trickling in, but of course very difficult because the rescue effort has been hampered because of the potential for danger. When we were down there, police continued to move us north, so we would be in one area considered safe, and then moments later they would come and move us a couple of blocks north more, saying that there was potential for more explosion. This was after both towers had already fallen. So it's difficult for them to get in. There have been hundreds of people taken to area hospitals, critically injured, as well as people who have not made it. And as far as people that may be still trapped or dead in the rubble, that information is still coming to us very slowly, Tom.
Thank you, Virginia. We have on the phone now the Jordanian ambassador to the United States, Marwan Marasher, and Jordan, of course, is one of the moderate Arab states. It's always had open lines of communication to this country. It has a new monarch since the death of King Hussein, and we're joined on the telephone now by Marwan Marasher. There are going to be a lot of Americans, obviously, Mr. Ambassador, who are upset by those scenes of some Palestinians on the West Bank who have been celebrating this day. What has been the official reaction of your government?
First of all, I'd like to express our condolences to the victims of the families and our strong condemnation for the act. His Majesty King Abdullah just sent a message of condolences to the President, and the government has issued its strong condemnation of this heinous and senseless crime. I need to say that the scenes that we've seen on TV are largely those of few kids on the streets. I cannot believe, and I do not think that there is anybody who would really condone such heinous crimes. And I have no doubt that the Palestinians, as the rest of the Arab world, joins the United States in condemning the attack and in really willing to do everything possible to help with all future moves.
As I recall, there was a report that your king was scheduled to come to America sometime this fall. Is that trip still on so far as you know?
In fact, the king was on his way, and he could not land in the United States. He was in mid-air when these attacks took place, and he had to turn back and go back to Jordan because of the incidents.
Mr. Ambassador, this is going to be a trial for all parties, not just the United States, but Arab states in this, in your part of the world, also for Israel and for right-thinking people everywhere. Do you think that there ought to be some extraordinary summit meeting of some kind to deal with this, what we now know is the cold, harsh reality of terrorism in our lives?
Absolutely. First of all, I need to say that Jordan has always cooperated very strongly with the United States in stemming terrorist attacks. The terrorist attacks that were about to take place during the turn of the millennium, Jordan played a key part in informing the United States about these attacks. We continue to hold very steadfast in our efforts to combat terrorism everywhere. We, of course, still do not know who did these crimes, and perhaps it is still early to tell or assign blame, but whoever did them certainly deserves to be punished, I think.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for being with us today, and we're sorry that King Abdullah was not able to make his trip to the United States, but perhaps he'll be able to do it later in the year. Thank you again for joining us. Maurice Dubois is in Paris. He works for WNBC here in New York. Maurice? Yeah, Maurice, tell us what's been going on in the French capital.
Tom, I'm as stunned as anybody. My new wife and I were coming back to New York from our honeymoon from Charles de Gaulle Airport to Paris. We were halfway across the Atlantic between Paris and New York when the pilot got on and said we were turning around. And it almost sounded like one of those moments where he would, be kidding, like you've heard pilots joke around before. But it was obvious that he wasn't, and we turned around, and no one knew exactly what was going on for a good hour. And by the time he told us, and as the word spread throughout the plane, I mean, stunned doesn't even begin to describe how everybody reacted. And right now there's hundreds of people on the ground at Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport looking for places to stay for the night and looking for information, any shred of it we can find. People are gathering around television sets, commiserating. Rumors are flying. People aren't sure exactly what's going on, but here we are.
Television carrying this kind of wall-to-wall?
Exactly. As you would expect, like in the United States, the French are mulling it, trying to dissect it, trying to digest it. No one really has any idea. I mean, stunned is the only word I can think of, because I still am. I mean, we got off the plane about a half an hour ago. And we're still trying to make some sense of it.
All right, Maurice Dubois, who works for WNBC here in New York, who was returning from his honeymoon, and he was turned around over the Atlantic and returned to Paris because no planes were allowed to land in the United States. There's one report that transatlantic flights would be diverted to Canada. It was a fair amount of chaos today. We can only imagine what air traffic controllers were going through, especially when those 4 planes were hijacked almost simultaneously. And then it does appear that they tried to fly so low because they might have been trying to escape some radar detection on what they were up to, both in New York and in Washington, D.C. There were eyewitness accounts of the airliners going over Washington Square Park here in New York at a very low level, and also over Lafayette Square in Washington, in the heart of the Capitol, at a low level moments before they crashed into the Pentagon and into the Twin Trade Towers. Ken Allard is another one of our national security and terrorist experts, and he joins us now. Mr. Allard, we've been asking everyone all day long, and most experts have been saying, look, I did expect that there would be some kind of a terrorist incident, but uniformly, most people have been stunned by the magnitude of this one and how sophisticated it was.
Well, Tom, I have to say that I'm as stunned as anyone else, simply because of the fact that although we had seen the sophistication, apparently, of the Osama bin Laden network, being able to target 2 embassies in Africa almost simultaneously, the ability to put 4 teams into the air to hijack these airliners, the precision with which they executed this operation also suggests that it was extremely well planned. So again, the thing that I think has crumbled to the ground, along, unfortunately, with the World Trade Center, are some of our preconceptions about the nature of this challenge and, frankly, their ability to carry out operations within the United States.
What kind of extraordinary measures are going to have to be put in place besides beefing up security at the airports, in your judgment?
Well, Tom, life is going to change. I mean, not only are we going to see much more intrusive security at places like airports and other places where we gather in public, but we are also, I think, going to see some major changes in American foreign policy. We simply have to take another view of how we have fought terrorism. We have looked at this thing in terms of the criminal justice paradigm. In fact, the president said today that we're interested in bringing these people to justice. I think most Americans, once the shock fades, are less concerned about bringing them to justice than sending them to hell. And I really think that more than anything else, what you're going to see is a new seriousness about the nature of this challenge. We clearly need to be much more involved with the international community in a leadership capacity with it. But more than anything else, I think that life has changed both at home and abroad for the United States today.
Mr. Allard, do you think that we're going to have to go so far as to put armed undercover people on some of these commercial airliners? El Al has been doing that for a long time.
I think we'll probably see that. I think we'll see that sooner rather than later, simply because of the fact the last time that we went through this, back in the 1970s, we put sky marshals on board and it began to stop that whole rash of hijackings that we had had. We've gotten in this country, unfortunately, a little bit lax. Those of us that have spent any time at all traveling in Europe are constantly surprised when we get back to the United States to find that the standards are not quite the same. We've enjoyed, Tom, I think, a great deal of security and in this country without having to necessarily be worried about all these threats. Well, that's, again, one of the things that changed today in this country, and I don't think it's going to be back anytime soon.
Thank you very much. Ken Allard, who is a National Security Affairs Authority and an expert on terrorism as well, echoing what so many people have said today about how our lives are going to change and the magnitude of this attack, which has stunned almost all the authorities who have looked at this. They did expect some kind of a terrorist incident, but not anything as complex or as sophisticated or as effective in the most cold-blooded way as this one has been. We're going to go to the Pentagon now, I think. NBC Jim Miklashevsky.
Couple of issues that Ms. Clark addressed a few minutes ago. We didn't have good answers for. We do have a couple of them now. All of the service secretaries and all of the service chiefs are accounted for. Also, all military installations around the world are at Force Protection Condition Delta. D as in Delta. That's as high as it goes. Normally that is imposed on a local basis, but given the magnitude of the attacks today, it was directed worldwide. Those two things.
About the F-16.
Oh, there was a rumor earlier today, several hours ago now, that some F-16s or one F-16 had shot down some plane somewhere. That didn't happen. I cannot explain to you the cause of the crash of the airplane near Pittsburgh, but it was not engagement by a U.S. fighter aircraft.
What happened? What about fighter aircraft?
I don't have an estimate on that.
What about the two carriers?
There was a rumor hours ago that there was a fighter that had shot down an aircraft.
It's not. So the U.S. Air Force is not shot down. Do you know anything about the plane?
Admiral Quigley, that was just a few moments ago on videotape. He was trying to confirm that all the service chiefs are in a secure location. So is the Secretary of Defense. He also said an F-16 did not shoot down anything. I had not heard that rumor. There have been a number of them flying around today. We've tried to share with you as best we can just what we have been able to confirm. There was a period of great uncertainty, obviously, in the early hours, but now, for several hours, the questions that we have primarily in our mind are how many people are still trapped and how many people may have been killed in the World Trade Center and at the Pentagon when those planes went down. We do know that the death toll from the hijacked planes, the passenger list and the crews, 266 altogether. On the phone with us now is the ambassador from Egypt, Nabil Sami, who joins us. Egypt, of course, has been one of those moderate Arab states that has been closely aligned with the United States. We have a strong military relationship. Mr. Ambassador, what has been the official reaction of your government to what happened here today?
We have unequivocally condemned this atrocious act. The President has publicly made a statement to that effect, and President Mubarak has also sent a condolence message to President Bush. The loss of life, innocent loss of life, whether they are civilians or military, is simply an atrocious event which we truly condemn. And
Mr. Ambassador, within your own country, you too have been targets of what I think you could fairly describe as Islamic radicals and terrorists. They have directed their rage against your government. Is there going to have to be some kind of a new effort internationally between countries that may not be necessarily aligned with each other ideologically to do something about this terrorism?
We faced the problem of terrorism quite seriously in the early 90s. It has subsided since then. We were quite ready and cooperative in holding different, engaging internationally on this issue. I think we will, needless to say, continue to do so. I would, nevertheless, at this point, refrain from getting into exact details until we see all of the information as to what exactly happened, where, and when. But this is truly something that we condemn.
Yeah, our correspondent in Tel Aviv, Martin Fletcher, reported that within recent days, the Egyptian government has been critical of the United States in the Middle East as the escalation of violence between Israel and the PLO has begun to take an ever higher toll. Has your government been critical of the United States?
Our relations with the U.S. are strong and frankly quite constructive. Whether we agree or disagree on issues, that does happen. But nevertheless, we've urged the U.S. to play a more prominent, more high-profile role. That is one thing. This does not justify in any way what we've seen here today.
Don't you think it's going to be more difficult for the United States to play that kind of a role if, in fact, we discover that these acts were committed by Islamic activists and radicals? If,
and I underline if, because, again, let's not forget that we've witnessed cases before where people have been accused of situations like this in Oklahoma, and this has proved not to be the case. But if these were acts of terrorists, they are terrorists, not reflective or representative of the people of the region. I'm aware of no Arab government that has in any way said anything but a severe condemnation of what we've seen here today.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much, and you're absolutely correct in that last declaration. All of the governments in the Middle East have uniformly condemned this, including the Taliban government in Afghanistan, denying that Osama bin Laden played any role in these attacks in New York City and in Washington, D.C. Osama bin Laden is widely regarded as the #1 terrorist in the world and is widely believed to be harbored within Afghanistan by the Taliban, although they have always denied that. Let's go to NBC's Robert Mazzell, who has been staked out all day long at St. Vincent's Hospital, which is very close to the carnage in Lower Manhattan. I guess he's back now. Bob, what do we know about casualties at this point?
The casualties have certainly been there, Tom. I saw dead and mangled bodies myself. They've been coming in all day long in a steady stream. St. Vincent's Hospital, where I is the closest trauma center. However, an emergency plan went into effect today involving every one of the 190 hospitals in New York City. Hundreds of doctors and nurses turned out at every location. In Greenwich Village, which is where St. Vincent's Hospital was, there were so many people showed up to donate blood that some of them had to be turned away and taken to other hospitals. However, every physician that I spoke with said that this is just the beginning. There's kind of an eerie calm to the fact that they've even at one hospital seen only 250 injuries, about 30 of them serious. Everybody expects that there's a lot more people trapped under that rubble, and it's going to take a long time to get them out. The injuries have included just about everything. They've been massive trauma, the severe burns, smoke inhalation, and a very high percentage of them have been firefighters, police officers, and other emergency workers, because those people were very close in, especially when the second tower fell down. So we're going to see an enormous carnage, I think, among the people who were there to help today, Tom.
All right, thanks very much, NBC Robert Mazzell. Bob, just let me ask you one other question. The nature of the injuries, I gather a lot of them were burns, and smoke inhalation was a huge problem, right? Well,
both smoke inhalation and a lot of trauma from falling stone and bricks from the collapsing buildings. So there was much more of a variety. They were comparing it at this hospital to the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, and most of the injuries there were from smoke inhalation because of the smoke was coming up from the basement. There was a very sad story at St. Vincent's Hospital where a nurse was emailing her husband, who was trapped on the upper floor of the second building, and the email stopped and she looked out the window and saw the building collapse.
Oh my God. You mean a nurse was at St. Vincent's Hospital, was on email to her husband in the...
So her husband was working in the hospital in the second tower, the remaining tower. He was emailing her that he was okay. They were back and forth. She was running off to do her duties. The emailing stopped. She looked out the building and saw the building collapse. It's one of what we're going to, I believe, thousands and thousands of stories like that happened in New York today, and we're going to hear many more.
Robert Bazell, thank you very much. Difficult duty all day long. We also heard the haunting tale of one of the people who was able to get out by running down some 50 stories. He saw people who were trapped in their wheelchairs, the large motorized kinds of wheelchairs, and of course with all the electrical circuits out, there was no way for them to get out of that building. It was in 1993, you'll remember, when we were all horrified by what we saw at the World Trade Center when a bomb went off in the parking garage. That was nothing compared to what happened here today. Both Twin Trade towers came down, 110 stories altogether. This now, almost 8 hours later, that's still the residue of smoke and dust and debris in the greatest skyline in the world, missing two of its most emblematic buildings. The trade towers that house not only Morgan Stanley, but government buildings, including the Secret Service has an office there, and the FBI and other institutions of the federal government are located there. We'll find out later, of course, but obviously the terrorists who attacked the building in 1993, now they've come back, a group, perhaps the same alignment, perhaps a different one altogether, and attacked it more successfully by hijacking two planes and driving them into the building, either getting the controls themselves or forcing, and this seems hard to believe, a pilot to do that for them. We don't have the answers to so many of those questions. We'll only ask you to stay with us as we work our way through this long and difficult day that will change this country in so many ways. Mr. Standish from Jane's Intelligence Digest, Alex Standish, who's still with us from London. How can free democracies deal with terrorism even if they had the will to all get together and settle on one plan? Mr. Standish, can you hear me? Well, apparently we've lost our audio connection. Let's go back to Ken Allard, who joined us earlier from Washington. We saw him often during the Gulf War and other times when there have been national security crises in this country, but nothing to measure up to this one. I think that it's fair to say, Mr. Allard, we've been describing this as an act of war. It is nothing less than that. It's the single most devastating attack on this country since Pearl Harbor. It is going to take an exceptional response, not only in tracking down and finding those responsible, but how we secure ourselves for that in the future. The question that I asked earlier, there are limits on democracy. Tony Lake said earlier we can't give up liberties to preserve our liberties.
Well, Tom, that's true. In trying to grope, for some historical perspective on this, and again, you've written a lot about World War II yourself. The thought that occurred to me was what Admiral Yamamoto said after Pearl Harbor. You remember he said that all that we have done is to waken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. And one would hope that that is exactly what's going to happen here. If the United States, if the American people, in the aftermath of this, can come together and basically support whatever has to be done, both in their internal security, in our internal security here, as well as probably some new directions abroad. That's probably the most that we can hope for. It is a day of tremendous tragedy. The only thing that you can hope for is that we react to this in the right way.
We did have to, during World War II and during the Civil War, give up certain liberties, at least for the short term. You think that that's going to be what's going to happen this time as well?
Well, Tom, there's no way to upset the American people any more than by telling them something that they have to do when they don't really want to. And that's true of any of us that try and rush through airports at the last minute. But, it's very, very clear that we're going to have to make some adjustments in the way that we think about these things, simply as the price of living in a much more turbulent world than I think many of us had fully realized up until today. That's going to involve not only those kinds of things, it's going to involve some very, very tricky questions for the FBI and the various other agencies that are going to be pursuing this investigation. Very simply because the fact that whatever the terrorists were that carried out this operation today had help within this country. And it's going to become an extremely difficult thing, and it's also very clear to me looking at this that some of what we have looked at before in terms of the judicial prohibitions, in terms of the judicial restraints, are going to have to be relooked again, simply in light of this new heightened sense of vulnerability that we have in this country.
Mr. Allard, thank you very much. We're going to now report on something that we've been holding for a time. We had heard earlier, and I alluded to this, that there could be some prominent people on board these planes. The plane that went from Dulles to Los Angeles, for example, and then was driven into the Pentagon. Ted Olson, who is the solicitor of the United States, he argued before the U.S. Supreme Court on behalf of George W. Bush